Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. Thanks for joining us today. For those who might not be familiar with us, AHS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit institution that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the principles of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate programming in college campuses in Washington, D.C., and New York, and our 1,000 alumni are really working across the country on some of these issues. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org. Today, I'm not only pleased, but actually really honored to be joined by the author of a new and incredibly important book titled No Escape, The True Story of China's Genocide of the Uyghurs. Nury Turkel, the author of this book, which is, I think, part memoir, really personal, his own personal story and the story of his family, part history, I think trying to bring to the American audience sort of a better understanding of the Uyghur people and their plight. And also, I think, part call to action, which is what could or should the United States and others in the free world actually do about this situation. Nury is an attorney by trade, a foreign policy expert, and a human rights advocate with several decades of experience in the space. He is currently serving as the vice chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom after being appointed by now Speaker Nancy Pelosi a couple years ago. He's also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And as a human rights advocate, he's led efforts to raise the profile of the Uyghur cause, previously as the president of the Uyghur American Association, and now the chair of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which he founded almost 20 years ago, I guess. In 2020, he was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. And in 2021, he was listed as one of Fortune's 50 greatest leaders, which I think show the testament to Nury's courage, dogged pursuit of justice, and I think the ability to really kind of make the issue known. So Nury, really welcome. Thanks for spending time with us, and really it's a wonderful book.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabe. If I may, I'd like to thank the Alexander Hamilton Society for the opportunity that it has given me for more than a year now, speaking with the members at various campuses through in-person and the virtual events. And I'm particularly grateful to you, Gabe, for selecting me as a speaker to members. And I appreciate the opportunity to share my story and stories of those Uyghurs who have been either languishing in the Chinese concentration camps and going through a traumatic experience around the world. I'm profoundly grateful.
Well, that's kind of you. Well, I don't want to make this about AHS. I want to make this about the book and about your work. So why don't we dive right in? And as always, if you're interested in asking questions, you can submit them in writing through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and then I can actually call on you and unmute you and ask your question directly to Nury. So Nury, the last week has actually been a busy week on the policy front. The Secretary of State Blinken actually just wrapped up really a few minutes ago, the administration's China strategy speech. I think it was late last week or maybe early this week. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation released a huge trove of new leaked documents that it's dubbed the Xinjiang police files, which I think has gotten good, but maybe not enough media attention. And the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights herself is actually on a week-long trip to China, which has generated, I think, some controversy. So there's actually a lot of policy questions going on, and we'll get to that. But I actually want to start first with your story. You yourself was born in a re-education camp. I won't say the year to spare all of us, but in a re-education camp. You came to the United States in your 20s and have since then basically not been able to see your parents and your family. This is a very personal experience and story for you. And maybe you could use that to just tell us a little bit about how did you go from just being I don't want to say a regular kid born in a re-education camp. That's not quite right, because that shouldn't be a regular occurrence. But how did you go from just your own personal story to coming to the United States, to doing some really interesting legal work, and to now really being, as you say yourself in the book, sort of in awe of the fact that you're a government official, actually, by virtue of being on the commission?
Thank you very much. as I wrote in the book, I was born in a re-education camp during the height of the Cultural Revolution. When my young mother was detained in a re-education camp because of her family connection, specifically being a daughter of a Uyghur nationalist leader, who despised the occupying Chinese government, communist government then. And also my dad's relationship with his own cousins in Soviet Union. My father was sent to a labor camp, agricultural labor camp, 3 hours away from my place of birth, Kashgar, while my mom went through physical and verbal abuses. She was raised in a very conservative environment. She was subject to various slanders and suggestive words that she was carrying a baby, which was me. And she went through physical abuse that resulted in her getting injured. While she delivered me, she was in the cast still, chest down. After I was born, we were taken in again to the camp. I spent the first several months of my life with my mother in a re-education camp in a Soviet style building with huge windows where wood panels were put to block the natural sunlight and visual. As I describe it in the book, I was walking by with my mother, this particular place that later turned to a shopping mall. Oddly, two of my uncles opened stores in a new shopping mall and the site of a re-education camp where I was born. I did not choose this life. My fate, the ongoing repression in the last 5 decades that I have been able to witness and also experience, and also sound an alarm early on, and now fighting to shut down this modern day concentration camp in an industrial scale. The BBC revelation that was reported a couple of days ago didn't come to me as a surprise, because I profiled through my interviews with the camp survivors and victims, direct, indirect. I profiled much of the stories being told by BBC through this police files. But what was riveting, what was heartbreaking beyond words that I cannot even fathom to put out a tweet, was the faces, those children and innocent men and women who've been subject to these brutal behaviors. My political life initially started with setting up this Uyghur Human Rights Project that Gabe was mentioning earlier. The setting up that human rights organization has a lot to do with the global environment. This was around the time that I was still first-year law student. I realized that the international community must know the true nature of the Communist Party and its brutal policies being implemented for a period as long as I have been breathing. And the 9/11 was a trigger. As you know from your reading, that shortly after 9/11, China claimed to the world that they are also, China also is a victim of global terrorism. And I thought that it was wrong for the international community and some of our policymakers to pay even attention to it, let alone dancing together, as was the case in the early part of War on Terror. To our advantage, I was pleased that Secretary Pompeo revoked that initial designation of this Uyghur organization, claimed to be in existence in Central Asia. And it's so hard. It's just incredibly painful that in the face of this ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity that Secretary Blinken eloquently described today, I was lucky to be in the audience listening to his speech. The international community, except for the United States, really has not been able to take a position, let alone showing a strong policy decisions. So I wish I have a normal life like most people, working one job, going home, spend time with the family, and also being able to spend time with people, parents in my case, who brought me to this world. I was able in an official trip to Tashkent, Uzbekistan in early April, representing USURF. And I heard the news of my dad's passing on my arrival, even physically so close to the regional capital, Urumqi, where my father was living. I could not go because I was sanctioned by PRC last December, and now I'm sanctioned by Russia a few days ago, along with those large number of U.S. officials and American citizens. So that could give you a sense that I did not even have a chance to be around my mom, hold her, and carry my dad's casket. It's been a extremely costly work for me. The fact that I entitled my book, put a title, No Escape, speaks volume. Even though now I'm a U.S. official, I work in this amazing think tank, Hudson Institute, and a fulfilling legal career. I'm not that free. The looming threat against me and my family members still exist, present, and I haven't seen my mother since my law school graduation in 2004, and I don't know if I will see her again because China is taking hostage of a U.S. official family.
So you covered so much in that, which was great, and I want to go deeper on each of those things. And so maybe we can start with the actual what is going on. I think most Americans, or those that I think, which is not enough of them, but those that know enough about what's going on, I think they think of the Uyghur in the sense of what's going on the last 5-6 years, which is sort of the construction of these massive Orwellian titled sort of re-education camps again, in that vein, and then some of what the U.S. policy response has been. But to your own point, to your own story, that's not the whole of it. It's not even the whole of it right now, let alone where it came from. And so maybe you can actually first walk us through a little bit the history of the Uyghur people, and certainly after the creation of the People's Republic of China, and sort of how the Chinese government has actually treated the Uyghur people, even leading up to 2016, 2017, where obviously there's been a marked turn for the worse.
Let me just paint a picture of what life is like like in the Uyghur homeland that the Uyghurs call East Turkestan today. Imagine that you live in fear daily, being dragged to modern-day concentration camps, simply because of your ethnicity, religious belief. And a simple act at your home, such as leaving the back door rather than front, causes Chinese police to show up and check up on your suspicious behavior. And if you communicate with relatives abroad, like the cases of most Uyghurs, luckily I have a means and ways to communicate with my family, perhaps because of my official U.S. officials' identity or status. Most Uyghurs cannot even speak with their family members because of potential retaliation. And imagine that police installs a QR code on your door, checking on who lives there and what kind of activities takes place at your place of residence, most private place for any of us, that you should be able to communicate with your family members, engage in meaningful conversation, and to be able to educate your children. So that is the reality of the people at your home. And also imagine that the government implants as officials in your family, monitoring every activities. And in some instances, as I have profiled, making the children to spy on their parents. And imagine that the government uses the terms like clearing out the weeds to refer your religious and ethnic identity, pride, way of life. In one instance, the Chinese official who has been on the news a lot, Chen Quanguo, who was sanctioned by the Trump administration under the Global Magnitsky Act, said you cannot root all the weeds hidden among the crops in the field one by one. What you need is chemicals that you need to spray to kill them all. And also just the re-education camp that you've been reading in the last 2 days with those 2,000 plus faces essentially a weeds to the Chinese government that they wanted to spray chemicals to clear out or weed out. And then Xi Jinping himself, as Adrian Zenz just put out a tweet today, how involved that he was in the policy making and the implementation. Xi Jinping himself said in the first leaked document, I quote, the Chinese Communist Party must not hesitate or waver in the use of weapons of people's democratic dictatorship and focus our energy on executing a crushing blow. This is when the statement like this puts out by someone like Xi Jinping, it becomes a state policy. So the enforcers, including Chen Quanguo and Ma Shunri now, who is sitting in the Communist Party secretary position, thrives and strives to exceed his superiors' expectation. Unlike the United States or other civilized liberal democracies, there's no public debate, there's no academic papers need to be written, there's no investigative journalism. So whatever the policy pronouncement made in such a brutal nature, it becomes a policy. Based on various reports, specifically the figure put out by former Secretary of Defense Randy Schreiber, there are around 3 million Uyghurs were imprisoned, interned in a modern-day concentration camps. This number may not be accurate, even by listening to Chinese own statements, white paper since 2015 through 2019. They put through 1.3 million Uyghurs through re-education camps. So when you look at the pictures on the BBC website, you can see what kind of people that they have in the camps, including children. One image that I could not stop thinking is this 13-year-old girl who is in the pictures being circulated around the world, and 73-year-old mother who's happened to be just a year older than my own mother. What kind of crime that 73-year-old woman, 9-year-old a child would commit? This is essentially Tom Cruise's Minority Report movie described scenes, preemptive policing. So anyone who has been identified through technology, integrated joint operating platform that Human Rights Watch reverse engineered, essentially was the platform that the Chinese used to round up everyone should be rounded up. And what else is happening? They also using slave labor to pollute the global supply chain. Secretary Blinken mentioned that specifically today. The United States government has announced a number of significant policy decisions, starting from the Trump administration, business advisory, blacklisting entities, companies in Commerce Department's entity list, GlobeMac sanction on Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, XPCC, which is a paramilitary unit that controls much of the water resources and cotton production. Secretary Blinken also mentioned more than 80 countries that have adopted the Chinese surveillance techniques being used to threaten democratic norms, privacy, and used to squelch political dissent around the world. So this regime not only using these technology and modern day slavery for its political economy or to secure their sense of insecurity, they're also trying to make it a new norm. So today, slavery is sort of okay practice, except for the United States. None of the major liberal democracies put in place any legislative mandate or any executive action to tackle these behaviors. Essentially, the Chinese polluted the global supply chain with the slave labor-produced products that includes anything that you buy in stores, cotton-based products, consumer products. If it's made by China, the chances of them being produced is by the Uyghur people, as reported, is quite high. And also the solar panels being made by Uyghur slaves. And also, and finally, they've been actively engaging in transnational repression, as I alluded earlier. Those of us who live in freedom, those of us who have become a citizen of our adopted countries have been subject to Chinese harassment, intimidation, and retaliation. So this is a full swing of a global scale operation that many countries either looking the other way or thinking that it will go away. I have a news for those individuals, policymakers around the world. This is not going to go away. And essentially, the global community, the investors and consumers feeling this ongoing genocide.
One of the things that struck me throughout your book, and some of what you just said now too, which is that that this is premeditated, that this is centralized, that this is a decision taken at the highest level, and that while the government certainly tried to hide it, at least at the beginning, soon thereafter, they sort of talked about it actually a lot more publicly. And some of the files and a lot of what we know actually is from government documents itself in that vein. And that analogy is not, or that phenomenon leads me to an analogy that I don't want to use often, but one that reminded me quite a lot of Nazi Germany. And you yourself, I think, in the book, talk about the equivalent of an Adolf Eichmann in this story. And so how should Americans, you think about the Uyghur genocide? Is Nazi Germany an appropriate analogy, or is that something that we should use a little sparingly?
You know, this is not a Holocaust. I need to make it very, very clear. The 6 million Jews sacrificed their lives to earn that or own that word. But the similarities that I find identified in this book is breathtaking, to say the least. The thought process, the thinking, and also the implementation reminds us nothing but the experience of 6 million Jews and Romas under the Hitler regime, or during the Holocaust or during the Second World War. Few similarities. Let me also say this, the camp that I was born and spent a few months, and also the environment that I grew up, much like the Stalin Soviet-style Gulag and Soviet-style social control punishment of dissidents. But the current, the ongoing Uyghur genocide has so much similarity, starting with the concentration camp. As you know, the concentration camp is also a very sensitive and also very controversial word to the extent. During the process of writing this book, I interviewed a historian who has studied and written books on the history of concentration camp. And there's something jumped out at me so similar to what the Jewish people experience is the way that they rounded up or being subject to mass internment, collective punishment based on religion, ethnicity is disturbingly similar. And before even that, just much like what Hitler did, the Xi Jinping's China also going after social elites, thought leaders, academics, business leaders, religious leaders. As we speak, there's a significant number of university professors, stage performers, authors, that includes the former president of Xinjiang University, who has a PhD from a university in Japan and an honorary degree from France, Dr. Tashblat, and many others. Some of them even include our fellow Americans who have been looking for their family members. That's one similarity. The other one is targeting women and children. In my book, I have a chapter on China's war on Uyghur women that has been carried out through forced sterilization, forced labor, and also the sexual violence that includes forcibly shaving women and using that as a commercial products to sell even people in the United States. The CNN profiled 13 pounds of human hair, believed to be from the prisoner's hair, sold to African-American community or a woman with a darker brown hair preference in the United States. You can look this up. That was just one shipment. And then other similarities that I found it to be quite disturbing is the targeted attack on Uyghur children. The Chinese have reportedly, this was reported in the New York Times, at least 800,000 Uyghur children been taken into state-run orphanages. Ironically, Chinese call those institutes or places or camps as a school of guardian angels. And also yesterday's, the recent BBC revelation also shows a significant number of Uyghur children's faces. I've talked to several of those parents looking for their missing children. The NPR This American Life profiled one of those parents based in Turkey who recognized his child's face in state-run propaganda video footage that was circulated on TikTok. And finally, one other similarity is the appeasement. The international community is showing, much like the way that Newell Chamberlain's UK did to Hitler. That started with 1936 Olympics. We just saw still significant participation of the Genocide Olympics in February. Not only that, the business, American businesses, European businesses, continue to sponsor the Olympics, including the one just concluded in February. Those companies include Nike, Visa, Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, Omega, Airbnb. And those are the same companies implicated in forced labor practices. So the international complicity, appeasement, is also another disturbing similarities between Hitler's Germany and CCP's Xi Jinping's China.
Let me ask you about one more potential similarity, which is today, Secretary Blinken and I think in the previous administration too, went to great length to distinguish between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party and the regime in that vein. How aware in your mind, or how complicit might be in your mind, the Chinese people to the genocide of the Uyghurs? I mean, in your book and in the work, obviously, we know that there are several 100,000 employed, let's say, by the state as security officers and construction workers of these camps and builders of roads to be able to get there and infrastructure to be able to put this into place. But how aware are the, and it's 1.4 billion, so obviously this is a generalized statement, but how aware are they, and what is your sense of their responsibility or understanding of what's going on?
That's a great question. I get this question often. I've been struggling to find a logical answer, but during the process of researching for my book, I came across a landmark 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, the American cultural critic Neil Postman. And based on what I read in this book, based on what I have observed and learned about today's China, I call China a mix of Brave New World in 1984. The Chinese Communist Party has created this Orwellian system of oppression, brainwashing, state control, and also at the same time allowed a handful of Chinese to become very wealthy. They could dance, they can post dance clips on TikTok or cat videos, and also showing their travel pictures, traveling around the world. And these people, same people, owns so those tech company, Chinese high tech. In some instance, some of those Chinese billionaires, millionaires send their kids to elite schools around the world, and some of them return. And some of those Chinese business elites jet around the world for wine tasting, shopping. They also have access to Hollywood movies. They have access to thriving restaurant life. They also have access to drug and the other means. So essentially, those people know the consequences of being in an Orwellian system or member of the Orwellian system. We have seen some of those instances. Recently, there was a book published by Desmond Shum, The Red Roulette, that explains some of those business elites in the Chinese society could end up like him, his ex-wife disappearing and himself going exile in the UK. So what is happening today in China is that even though the people who have exposure to Western world, free societies, education in the Western countries, being part of, and now being part of the Chinese elite, with all the access or the influence, decided not to criticize the CCP. In some instances, decided to take the Chinese Xi Jinping's policies or supporting Xi Jinping's policies for their own sake. So it's confusing. A Chinese author, novelist, Yan Lianke said in 2018, I had this in the book, I quote, "Living in China is confusing now because it can feel like being in North Korea and the United States at the same time." So this gives you an idea why we're not hearing from the people who might be otherwise influential at the same time, and those who might be willing to speak out don't have access to information or don't have means to air their frustration. So it is very disappointing. And to this day, we have not seen anything specific coming out of China condemning the Chinese government or even expressing concerns, saying things like, "Not in my name." Former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger delivered a speech in Chinese language on the occasion of Mayflower movement. Essentially, he challenged the Chinese people. Have you heard? Did you know that your government is operating concentration camps in your backyard? And the response is zero.
It's unbelievable. Although I guess it shouldn't be. Your mentioning of Matt Pottinger would lead to my next question, which is, and you talk about this again in the book, which is sort of the policy shift or the policy breakthrough maybe in the United States. And I think we could argue that it's not enough, but certainly a breakthrough to where we were just a few years ago. And this is a result of a lot of it is a result of efforts by people like yourself and other partners in this movement. But tell me, why do you think it was the Trump administration that was able to really make such a huge turn on this question? I mean, it's certainly not what many would have expected. I mean, you yourself in your book from election night in 2016 onwards for a couple of years, I think expressed skepticism that anything might move in that direction. But not only has the Trump administration initially made that breakthrough on the last day of the administration, it's the State Department and Secretary Pompeo put out a declaration that the United States government considered this a genocide. This was followed by the Biden administration. There's bipartisanship in Congress on this. I mean, it seems like it's a different world than the world we're living in when it comes to the rest of our politics. So why in your mind was the US government at least able to change the direction on things on this issue in particular?
In 2018, I was at the NSC for a meeting that I intend to brief the senior members of the Trump administration. And I was just keep talking, looking at my talking points. And one of those senior officials says in a very polite tone, "Nury, it's a lot worse than what you're describing." And I did not know what to say. I thought that I have been able to learn more than people might be able to do in the government. And that was very, very revealing. Essentially, that may have led to the government officials in the senior level to recognize that this is something need to be called out, the CCP. And I, as I do in my professional life, issue identification, recognition is as important as taking a tangible action. So by taking that policy position, starting with former Vice President Mike Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute, and then followed by the October 2019 a major decision, executive action, entity list designation, and others, followed and then lead to the enactment of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act in June 2020. I would say that there was a possibility that the policy shift was based on the recognition of the severity of the problem that CCP China is putting Uyghurs and others through. And then the other thing is that I think the Trump administration officials' deep belief in religious freedom, believing that if we let this go, if we let this continue to happen, this may not be just become a problem for the China or Uyghur people to deal with in the Chinese society. This also goes to the heart of our values as an Americans. Religious freedom is the first human rights for American people. It's older concept than human rights concept articulated in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I know and had firsthand experience working with senior officials in the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Brownback, and others, Vice President Mike Pence. I do genuinely believe that they believe that no one should be persecuted, punished collectively for their religious belief. And then the other aspect, I think there's a wider recognition in the Trump administration, the threat stemming from or coming from the CCP, ideological threat to be exact. And also, I also sensed and recognized that there was a wide acknowledgement of China's use of technology in religious persecution and human rights abuses within the China spheres, and also its exportation, threatening democratic freedom and values around the world. And finally, I would say this, and I've been saying this in public and private, the courage in the previous administration, senior officials displayed that it's okay to call out CCP China. It's okay to call them out based on their behaviors, based on the threat that they're posing on us, on our values, our national security, and our healthy relationship with the rest of the world. So those are the key factors, as you perfectly noted and stated. The Uyghur issues in the United States receives bipartisan support. The fact that the Biden administration not only continued and expanded some of those efforts speak volume.
And so what's next in your mind on the policy front? I mean, the administration's obviously been in office now almost a year and a half. Big speech this morning by the secretary on China strategy writ large. He didn't talk extensively on this question, but writ large, the administration clearly is focused on these issues. On the other hand, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act that you worked so hard on that passed a few months ago, that was 2 or 3 years in the making. Yes. In that vein. So if you were to outline, what would be the 2 or 3 things that you would like to see the United States government do next on this issue, what would they be?
To the Chinese regime, the world coming together as the way that under the US leadership in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine is dreadful. That they've been telling their own people and their supporters around the world, those despots and authoritarian figures and dictators, that US-led Western democratic leadership is over. Rules-based international system needs to be uprooted, and it needs to be replaced with their own. And now with this global alliance being displayed through in Europe in response to Putin's invasion, is something that can be translated or can be used as a model to establish a global alliance. It has been only the United States and a handful of European countries have spoken out, taken a position. And I challenged the rest of the European powers, specifically Germany and France, to join the effort. At the end of the day, this is not about just the Uyghurs. This is about freedom. This is about who we are as a civilization. And this is about what kind of future that we will need to create or leave behind for the next generation. So the Europeans, I would laser focus on Europeans, because we already seen something workable and working in both diplomatic effort, diplomatic front, as well as an economic front. It's possible. We were, if you put your energy and focus on this type of global effort, Secretary Blinken and the United States government already delivered in this kind of coalition building. And the other aspect is, I think we need to laser focus on the businesses. When I saw a significant number of global businesses either suspending or pulling out completely from Russia in response to the invasion was breathtaking. We're talking about over 100 companies around the world, global brands, major global brands, and some of them actually implicated in the slave labor practices in China. And yet, disturbingly, this genocide is in its 6th year. We have not here or seen one global brand said we will not do business in China because of the ongoing slavery of fellow human being. So the business community need to step up to the plate, and we need to, as a consumers. And the third thing is that as a consumers, they will not act on their own. 2 ways that we can force them to act. One is through a legislative mandate. This piece of legislation that Gabe you mentioning is significant, perhaps arguably the most significant legislative action, executive action, if fully enforced by the Biden administration, could be considered as the most significant since China joined the WTO to address some of the lingering issues in our economic relationship with communist China. In order to fix that, in order to create a positive environment, we have a legal tools now in our toolboxes. We have to use the power of the consumers. The power of consumers already proven to be very effective. During the Olympic broadcast, because of the activist communities calling not to watch the games, the NBC viewership dropped nearly 50%. That's a big loss in economic front for those companies, make money through advertisement and also for the network. So consumer activism is key. And we need to tell ourselves and tell our friends or children, even in my case, my son stopped asking me to take him to Nike. And I stopped going to the places where I used to buy my former clothes that I wear to work. As I noted that I used to buy Hugo Boss because it lasts forever, I cannot burn my old clothes, but I stopped going there 3 years ago after I first saw their name in the Australian ASPE report. My 6-year-old son understands that he cannot ask me to take him to Nike. I think that should be the model. Unless we do this, the business community will continue to profit from the slave labor. And finally, I am going to be very unkind to climate activists. And this is about life and death. And this is about my own well-being. This is about the health of our society. We need to stop saying things like we need to cooperate with China in climate change by ignoring human rights. Or we can, if I borrow John Kerry's or others' statement, we cannot continue to say, oh, we need to tone down on human rights criticism in order to get China on board. We are capable of fighting genocide and ecocide at the same time. American people can walk and chew gum at the same time. And we cannot, and we should not allow the environmental activists to suggest that saving the planet is more important than saving human lives. And we should not allow the climate activists or those like Elon Musk and others saying that we need to continue to buy battery from China. We need to continue to import solar panels because that's necessary for conserving energy and saving the planet. I have a news for them. China uses dirty coal. China uses slave labor for solar panel production. Is this allowed in the United States? We cannot compete with a regime that uses dirty coal and slave labor. And it does not take the United States 10 years to catch up with the Chinese solar panel industry. That is false on its face. And I've consulted with the policy experts, engineers, and businessmen and women, and they told me it may take about a year to do what some experts, spin doctors, being telling American people that we cannot compete with China. Yes, we can. This is America. We can do it. The United States can and able to do a lot of things, including to make solar panels at home.
I think what you're, and I'll be curious if you agree with this interpretation. A lot of what you're saying is that the reason this shouldn't be seen as a trade-off, it shouldn't be seen as well as Secretary Kerry said at one point that, well, if we really care about climate, then we need to be quieter on other things. The way around that trade-off is to identify that at its root, the issue is the regime, and that what it is doing to the Uyghurs is part of who it is and what it thinks it must do in order to survive and thrive accordingly, just like all the other things. In the United States, sometimes we don't like to talk about that aspect. We don't like to talk about the regime. It brings up memories of bad debates over regime change. It leads to fracturing because some people will say, well, how could we criticize others when we have problems here at home and so forth? People try and stay away from it. They try and talk about the actions that happen as opposed to the identity. What's your take on this? Do you think we should be talking about the regime itself, its ideology, how it works, why it operates? We should be going after it. You talked here a lot about going after maybe it's American businesses or individuals, but not necessarily the government as a whole. Or should we stay focused on the actions that come from it?
That's a brilliant question. And I'm comfortable saying the following. One, the PRC is not Russia. We might be able to get rid of, we might be able to have, and then we should have a new Russia after Putin. But I cannot say the same thing after Xi Jinping, we will have a new China. As long as CCP remains in power, as long as CCP's global ambition and sense of insecurity continue to display, then we will have a huge CCP China problem. So we have to be able to focus, and we should be able to focus on this a Communist Party ruled state. I would not even call it the normal government. I mean, in a normal government, Ministry of Foreign Affairs should not be a lower ranking than foreign policy team at the Communist Party level. That's not how it works. China's economic policy, national defense, foreign policy, social policies, all of it formulated by Communist Party. Even their public messages, disinformation campaign. So we have to stop treating China as a normal country. I know the regime change is a very sensitive word, but I don't think that the world have a stability and peace and stability around the world. And I don't think that any Chinese citizens, including Han Chinese people, have a dignified and respectful life as long as the CCP rules the country.
And so what does that mean in practice in your mind? I mean, what would it look like for us as a government, as a society, businesses, to not treat it just as a normal country, a normal regime?
Ideally, this is a very complicated question. And I will say this without getting into trouble. I know that I'm speaking in my personal capacity today, but I do believe that we need to provide all the necessary tools and means to the people of China. I'm sure that there are a lot of people are sick and tired of it, as has been displayed during the lockdown. What we're talking about is the size of the US population being locked down. Based on various reports, at least 41 cities under lockdown. That is essentially 1/3 of Chinese population, workforce. I mean, rather workforce. So this shows the frustration. I don't think that the Chinese people's silence is enduring. They will need to be speaking out. I really think that Chinese people, just like the way that the Taiwanese people rebuilt the country as one of the vibrant, healthy democracy, deserve to have a democratic system. So we need to support that. And I genuinely believe that this communism is a sick ideology. Much of the disastrous policies being imposed on the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers, and possibly on Taiwan, stemming from the CCP ideology and based on their sense of insecurity, based on their fear of their own citizens. They have a slogan. They are, this has been also part of the number 9 document that been available to public, initially secretive. China has a mission, constant struggle against Western influence. What does that mean? Free speech, free press, and human rights, democratic freedom, religious freedom. So we need to call it what it is. So I'm not in a policy position, but I've been conveying this, and it has not been gained much traction. But I think we need to empower the Chinese people. It's in their hands.
What is your sense, and of both what is it that we say and then how important we make it when we talk to the CCP directly about this. Obviously, over the last couple of years, we've been talking to them a lot less. But what is your sense of when the president speaks with Xi Jinping, when Secretary Blinken speaks with his counterparts, and at all other levels? What is the message that we are saying to them?
Words matter in diplomacy, and I think the persistency, coherent messaging is very important. I'll give you one example that was a disastrous. Last summer, through all the way to the diplomatic boycott announcement, the Biden administration stopped using the term genocide and crimes against humanity. That is shown as, that could be perceived as a weakness in Beijing. So we have to be very, very specific with our messaging. We need to call it what it is. Dancing around some key value-based messaging, words, expressions is unhelpful. When I deal with in my official work, I cover several countries that has a serious human rights or religious freedom issues. I use my opportunity always highlight, look, when you have a health, you don't have to lock up a significant number of your population in order to achieve social stability, create this harmonious society. Religious freedom, human rights, democratic freedom actually naturally get you to that position. You don't have to be this brutal. You don't have to be fearful of your own government. I'm sure this kind of messages internally during one-on-one conversation being conveyed. But as Peter Martin pointed out in his book, The Wolf Warrior Diplomacy, their position, their fanciful view of ruling the world, becoming number one, is overtaking some logic, some rational thinking. Appears to be the case in the Chinese leadership.
I'm struck by, and you'll forgive me, I'm actually struck by how elegant you make the case for why America is a different or a unique country to a lot of others around the world. You talk about it, it's a travesty why other liberal democracies won't say much and certainly not do anything about the question, and that why the United States stands out. And it just strikes me as, again, as someone like you, as an immigrant to this country, now working at the U.S. government, you make the case for why America's founding was different than really any other country around the world.
It's amazing. I always say this. I'm not in the public diplomacy position, but my story is a beautiful story to tell the world. And these dictatorial regime. I was in Uzbekistan meeting with senior cabinet level officials. I essentially told them, look, this is how it works in the United States. We don't do the things that you've been hearing from your neighbor on the other side. I was an immigrant, not only immigrant, I was granted asylum by the United States government. There's an opportunity in the United States. There's the values that hold us together, regardless of our ethnic and religious background. So people may think this is a kind of a pandering political speech, but I'm a U.S. citizen by choice. Former late Congressman Tom Lantos used to say that a lot. Being an American citizen is a privilege. I never considered myself a citizen of anywhere before because that was imposed upon me that I need to be a citizen of something, in my case, China. But my American citizenship, my ability to use my personal and official platform and opportunity to speak, not only for the Uyghurs, but others who have not been heard enough, is a privilege.
I actually can't think of a better way to end than what you just said, especially on such a difficult topic, to end with actually such an inspirational story and challenge. And so, Nury, thank you for all your work that you've done, that you continue to do. For those who haven't read the book, you should read it. I was telling to Nury before we started that oftentimes memoirs are written because the story is interesting, even if it's not told well. This one is actually, the story is fascinating, important, and told really, really very well. I learned a lot from your own writing, even though you and I have, as you said, you've spoken to AHS audiences before, and so I've gotten a pleasure to kind of hear you and know you. But even while reading this, I learned a lot. So thank you very much for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Gabe. I truly appreciate your support and your friendship.
Great. Have a great afternoon, everybody, and see you next time.